President Ronald Reagan once said that freedom is always one generation from extinction. 1 Samuel 8 gives us an opportunity to reflect on why that might be the case, and to contemplate our own complicity in the destruction of our own freedom. But in order for us to really understand what this text is doing, what the writer of 1 Samuel is doing in this chapter, we need to look at this issue from the standpoint of those who were asking Samuel for a king. There are certain problems that come with decentralized power. Problems that came, in their day, and problems that come in our own. Now, if you look there at verses 1 through 3, 1 through 4, thereabouts, what you see are the immediate causes of this request for a king. Samuel, you're old. And your sons, well, they're corrupt. Just to, not to put too fine a point on it, but they're corrupt. And these are, in fact, significant problems. The author of 1 Samuel tells us as much. The author of 1 Samuel affirms what the people say about their situation. So it's not that they are reading their situation wrongly. Moreover, this story finds its place in a much longer narrative. One that maybe we can lose track of if we're not sufficiently acquainted with the biblical story and with its background. Israel entered into the promised land at a particular time in the history of the ancient Near East. Now, Israel was a tribal confederation. That's really their form of government. And then the tribes were broken down into clans and then into families. And this sort of family mode of leadership also provided leadership for the state, such as it was. But of course, that also leads to a certain degree of political fragmentation, right? There's no one unifying power. And in fact, if you look in Judges, which narrates the centuries before this event, what you see, number one, are tribes that competed with each other as much as they helped each other. And second, what you see is fragmentary action. One tribe will act, or maybe two tribes will act, but you basically almost never see the entire people of Israel rallying to a cause. Now, from the standpoint of these elders, you can draw a straight line from that political fragmentation to military defeat. Now, we've read the story, so we know with, 3,100 years of hindsight or whatever, we know that there was more going on. There was all this idolatry and stuff, right? And that God removed his blessing because they were not faithful. But from their point of view, what they see is they see the political fragmentation producing the military defeats. Now, if that didn't make people feel unstable, this was a particular point in the history of the ancient Near East, like I said before, one in which the major powers were in weakening phases. Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia were all weakened during this period, and the Persians were not on the scene yet. But everybody in Israel knows this is not going to last forever. One of these great empires, or more, is going to reassert itself. It's only a matter of time. And they're thinking, we got to be ready for it. And then there's this final matter. Religious corruption. Now remember that everything in ancient Israel, and in fact everything in the entire ancient Near East, always has a religious component, okay? But when we look at 1 Samuel, one of the first things we learn about is the corruption of the high priest's sons. A corruption that makes Samuel's sons look like rank amateurs. In other words, as the elders are watching Samuel's sons pervert justice, what they're thinking is, oh, we've seen this story before. And when you have religious corruption, that produces all kinds of other corruption in a world in which religion is woven into the fabric of every aspect of society. They have no concept of a secular government. Now, that doesn't mean that their governments were always, shall we say, above board in how they used religion, used as the proper word a lot of times. But religion was always a part of their thinking, okay? And so when you have corruption in that sphere, you can just bet you're going to have corruption in every sphere of society. Now that's their world, okay? We live in a different world. But it's interesting how some of the issues can be similar. I know I've talked about this before, but I want to remind us of Yuval Levine's work on institutions in our society. Yuval Levine is an Orthodox Jewish scholar who works for the American Enterprise Institute. And he not only is an economist, a social scientist, etc., but he also is deeply acquainted with religious institutions and how they work. Now, what Dr. Levine says is that institutions are supposed to be formative. Now, why is that? Well, because in a decentralized power setup like a tribal confederation or a democracy like ours, it is the institutions that put checks on corruption. It's the institutions that give structure to the society. It's the institutions that help people know, oh, this is my role in the world. This is who I'm supposed to be. This is how I'm supposed to behave. Right? But what happens sometimes, and what is happening very often in our own context, is that institutions are becoming performative rather than formative. In other words, I don't go into the institution so that the institution can change me and make me into a proper agent of that institution. I go into the institution so that I can use the institution to foster my own agenda, to foster my own, platforming, to make me look good, to make me look big, right? That's what's happening in a lot of our institutions. I'll give you a couple of examples from Congress. It used to be that the trajectory of a representative in the House of Representatives was you got to Congress, you started learning how the place works. And over several election cycles, you did something like what former Representative Paul Ryan did. You sit on a committee or two or three, and you learn everything you can learn about that particular aspect of our government. For Paul Ryan, it was the federal budget. And you get to where you learn that inside and out. And so when other people in Congress, maybe even from other parties, need insight on how something works, they come to you. That's what happened with Paul Ryan, and eventually he was elevated to the speakership. Likewise, in the Senate, Benjamin Sass talks about how it used to be customary that a senator did not give a speech from the floor of the Senate for the first year of their first term. Why? Because your job as a first-year senator is to close your mouth, open your ears, and learn how this place works. Learn how we deliberate together. The Senate is supposed to be a deliberative body. How we deliberate to construct legislation. Was it a perfect system? No. Did it need reform? Maybe. But there's a difference between reform and performance. And what we so often see now in our political classes are people who would rather be standing up for a live shot on Fox News or MSNBC with the world burning behind them so that they can blame their opponents. It's the agenda of getting me elected, making me look big, making me, getting me Facebook followers or X followers or whatever, getting social media hits. That's the death of an institution. You see it in churches. People, pastors sometimes, they come into this line of business as a pastor because they think, use gullible people to get what they want. And in fact, we as individualistic Americans have an allergic reaction to being formed by our institutions. But here's what happens. Those institutions are absolutely necessary. And when they become performative rather than formative, guess what? They lose the trust of the public. Every institution in American life, even the United States military, is losing its trust with the American people. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about an actual like physical group of people like Congress, or whether you're talking about ephemeral social institutions like marriage. Every institution in American life is losing its favor with the public. But guess what happens? When you put so little trust in institutions, what happens? Those institutions lose their ability to restrain antisocial and anti-democratic behavior. Now, that's the cycle that we are stuck in as the American people. But what I hope you see is that there are some similarities between our situation and 1 Samuel 8. Now, with that in mind, here's what we have to do. Before we kind of move on to why this whole kingship thing is kind of a fool's errand, we have to give proponents of kingship their due. Because the Old Testament has kind of a mixed It gives us mixed signals about kingship. 1 Samuel 8 is down with kingship. But I want you to look there at, I put it up on the screen for you. I want you to look at Judges 21:25. By the way, this verse or something like it is found at least 2 times in Judges and maybe 3. There was no king in Israel. Each man, and as I've told you before, I think that the selection of that word, man, instead of human, is intentional there. Each man did what was right in his own eyes. That's not a compliment. Let's translate that into language that maybe we can understand. Freedom is not the same thing as anarchy. Right? Okay? Freedom is not the same thing as anarchy. And what the writer of Judges is saying is there's no king to rein in these crazy people. And by the way, he just spent the last, 4 or 5 chapters telling you how crazy these people are. That's why they come to Samuel asking for a king. Because they look at this life, they know there's something wrong with it. They know that it's broken. But we need to look more deeply at their motivations. Because God does not, in 1 Samuel 8, affirm their desire for a king. Why might that be? Well, it's because of what they want. They want conformity. Look further down in the chapter. When Samuel does go back to them and say, hey, here's what the king's going to do to you. You don't really want to do this. What is it that they say? They say, no, give us a king so that we will be like the other nations around us. They want conformity. Not just internal conformity, but external conformity. Used to be said that the National Football League is a copycat league. As soon as one offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator does something that's working, other people start to copy it. That's not just in football. Humans do that in lots of arenas of life. For all the world, it looked to these elders like this tribal confederation form of government was a failure. Now remember, Athens has not yet moved into its democratic phase. In fact, Athens is probably at this point little more than a village. Nobody has really experimented with sort of developing this tribal confederation form into something what we would call little r, Republican. Like Greece or Rome. Rome doesn't exist at this point. Athens is probably little more than a village, Nobody's really experimented with that yet. These guys are looking at this and they're thinking, hey, king's the way to do it. Let's do what they do. They want consistency. Now this is the one where maybe we can kind of understand them a little bit. They want consistent application of the law. They want consistent rule. They want to be able to get up in the morning and know what to expect. But perhaps the most telling thing that they want is control. Notice what God says about them. Now, when you first hear this, it can feel like, wow, God, you're being a little bit harsh here, aren't you? God's saying they don't want me as king over them anymore. Right? That's what he's saying. This isn't a rejection of you, Samuel. It's a rejection of me. Now, you are kind of thinking, now, God, wait a minute. Didn't you read the first 3 verses here? Don't you see what's going on? Well, yes, he does, but the truth is God knows them better than they know themselves. And what they really want, what we really want a lot of times, is to take control of history and shape it to our own ends. They want to be able to have some say over the course of their lives and over the course of their nation. And it's easy to think, well, who can blame them for that? Well, here's the thing. In doing so, they're rejecting an entire narrative, an entire way of thinking about life, one that centers on God's beneficent rule on their behalf. Remember, as much as people want to characterize this early Jewish form of government as a theocracy, it's really not. The people run their own everyday lives. They just have this legal code that God has given them to give them guidance. The priests don't rule in that way. It's local judges and regional judges that make these decisions, that render these judicial verdicts. Now, the priests are supposed to be able to make rulings on hard cases where God's insight is needed. But this is not a theocracy in the traditional sense of that word. God has given them far more freedom than their king will give them. But with that freedom comes responsibility, right? And one of the responsibilities is just recognizing that history moves in ebbs and flows. You're up for a while and then you're down for a while. And that's just the way of life. Do we trust God with the ebb and flow of history? And don't answer that question too quickly. Do we trust God with the ebb and flow of history? What God is saying is that these people in ancient Israel, these elders, do not. They want control for themselves. Now, of course, the irony is, because they are the elders, because they are the ones who are really making the decisions at this point, they have the most to lose from bringing in a king. But for whatever reason, they're not seeing that. They don't want to be subject to this wild and uncontrollable God. They want a king whom they can trust, interesting word, to act in certain ways. Now, I hope that at some level we can resonate with some of these desires. Maybe it's still our flesh, but hopefully we can resonate with some of these desires so that we don't look down upon them with judgment, so that we can see how this text could or maybe even does apply to us. But now we have to turn to the real meat of the text. They wanted, this consistency. They wanted conformity. They wanted control. But what are they going to get instead? That's what Samuel lists out for them, isn't it? There's going to be high taxation. There's going to be the confiscation of property, especially for those who are wealthy enough to actually have property. There's going to be the conscription of labor. Now let's talk about this for a second, this next one. The unequal distribution of goods. I gotta tell you, tyranny is an interesting response to public corruption. Because what you're doing is you're saying, okay, we've got these people who are corrupting the power that they have or using it for corrupt means. So let's just take all of that power and let's invest it in one person and give them absolute, privileges. What? It's like not just letting the fox guard the hen house, it's like giving the fox the key. And what Samuel is telling them is they're going to take your stuff and your slaves and give it to the king's attendants. Well, if that's not corruption, I don't know what is. Now, at some level, as a king, you kind of have to do it, because if you don't, you've got nobles underneath you who will do everything in their power to assassinate you and become king in your stead. And the way that you stay king, the whole way that this works, unless you have some other ideological conviction that helps the kingdom stay stable, the whole way you stay king is by keeping the powerful people under you happy. And it's by ensuring that you have people who are loyal to you and not to anyone else. That just invites corruption. And of course, in the end, there will be the loss of status. You will become his slaves. Gosh, that should have been a warning to them. Hey, wait a minute. Whoa. We don't want to do this. They had to know that Samuel was telling them the truth. But here's the thing. When we get our eyes as human beings fixed on one thing, a lot of times we don't see what else is going on. In criminal investigations, they call it tunnel vision, right? You get fixed on, well, it has to be this person who committed X crime. And you're not even considering all the other possibilities, even when evidence is brought to your attention that points away from your conclusion. Another way to think about it, we talk in social scientific circles about confirmation bias. It's a concept where people only pay attention to the information that reinforces what they already believed. For whatever reason, they can't see any of these things that Samuel is bringing to their attention. And oh, by the way, there's no promise that any of this is going to succeed. Right. You can still have a king with all the stuff that Samuel's talking about, people who make the weapons and all that kind of stuff. You can still have all of those things, and you can still get your fanny whooped in battle. God's people did it a lot. It's how Saul ended up dead, first king, right? There is no guarantee of success. But sometimes as humans, we get it stuck in our heads that if I just do X, Y will happen. And it just doesn't work that way. In the process of doing that, what we are doing is we are taking away God's lordship over our lives, over our country, over our world. We are taking the course of history in our own hands. In closing, there's a saying among historians that democracy is the worst form of government there is, except all the rest. And if you think about it, you can understand it. Democracy is messy. Jonathan Haidt, the moral psychologist, argues that actually we've been very fortunate in the United States, say between the end of World War II and say the advent of social media, so that 60 or 70 year period. We've been really fortunate. Democracy's been pretty easy. But for most of human history, democracy has been so hard that people haven't been able to pull it off. And yet, the common human experience is that tyranny of whatever kind, whether you're talking about absolute monarchy or some kind of aristocratic oligarchic system, or whether you're talking about dictatorship, military or communist dictatorship, it doesn't matter. Tyranny is worse. Tyranny is worse. So our responsibility as Christians is not necessarily to be cheerleaders for our government or for the American project or anything like that, but it is to share with people what we learn from Scripture. And what we learn from Scripture is there are no shortcuts to a healthy society. But we have to do our part in that too. We have to live what we say we believe. And what that means is we cannot be a people who are so obsessed with the political that everything becomes political. We cannot be a people who sells our souls to whatever political party will offer us what we want. Too many churches, denominations, religious institutions of various types are wholly owned subsidiaries of either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. They just are. You know, it's just the way that it is. That's not what we can do. Sure, we have a role to play. It's called public witness. We tell people what we really believe the Bible is calling us to do. But the most important things that we do are those most basic Christian functions: evangelism, discipleship, worship, care for the community. We do those things because those are the things that draw people into the kind of relationship with God that will keep them from political idolatry. Because in fact, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about political idolatry. Maybe you're not worshiping a king, although kings in the ancient Near East tended to demand worship. Maybe you're not worshiping a king, but you are putting your trust ultimately in that monarch. And in this case, not even in a person, but in a system of government to save you from what you think God is unwilling to save you from. That's what these guys were doing. And that's what we can do if we're not careful. That gives us a lot to think about as we approach the 250th anniversary of our country. And next Sunday, we're going to tell what Paul Harvey would call the rest of the story. We're going to see how this little experiment in kingship turned out. Let us pray.